Will the committee supply please come to order? This section of the committee supply will now resume consideration of the estimates for the Department of Finance. Questioning for this department will proceed in a global manner. The floor is now open for questions. The member for St. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back, folks. Glad to see that those who are ill are once again better and are here to speak and connect. Thank you so much. Just wanted to start out by talking a bit about some of the changes that were made at Hydro by this government in terms of the release of a number of government hydro workers, hundreds and hundreds of workers, and their replacement by private contractors, many of whom are from out of province. So I'm hoping the minister can maybe just provide, first of all, some numbers. What is the total number of Manitoba Hydro staff who were released since his government has come into power in 2016?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to answer the members' questions about workforce and workforce numbers. I know that we have information at the table, even as recent as the budgetary documents that were developed in respect of hydro, and those numbers indicated the workforce at hydro in 2021 were 49,504. The anticipated numbers in 2022 were 50,23, and the planning assumptions are for workforce at hydro to be 51,75 in 2023. So hydro continues to hire. Hydro continues to undertake to build its workforce. But there's a good news story here that this does give me the opportunity to tell. And that is, I just wanted to flag to the member that on page 26 of the Hydro's annual report, and I know we've brought a diverse number of documents to the table in these proceedings, but this is the Hydro portion of the Finance Committee of Supply. So I'll just reference for the first time this annual report released by Hydro just last week. And it indicates progress being made on targets and performance when it comes to diversity. And so I do want to flag to members there's been an overall amelioration even in terms of Indigenous workforce at Manitoba Hydro. Province-wide workforce has gone from an 18% target in 21-22 to an actual of 20%. Likewise, the northern workforce that identifies as Indigenous has risen in year from 47% to 49%. Indigenous in management component has risen from 8% to 9%. And that's in addition to things like persons with disabilities rising from 6 to 8%, visible minorities 9 to 10%. So some very, very significant gains in year. Women in management from 30 to 31%. The member knows that a number of years ago now, there was an overall campaign initiative, if you will, to try to address hydro workforce, and that had been largely done on a voluntary basis, where individuals who were nearing retirement could elect to take their years of service and their pensionable benefits, and in many cases additional payments, and to be able to leave a little early. And that was undertaken by a number of individuals. There was a senior management trim of 15%, a mandate given to all the Crown corporations. I believe that would have been around 2017, but I stand to be corrected, and we can confirm that or otherwise provide information as the afternoon goes on. And so that was important. To make sure that we were continuing to, as we said, get services to Manitobans and reduce that top-heavy administrative capability at many of our Crown corporations. So, as I indicated, the workforce continues to be built. Those diversity metrics show continued improvement. And then the other thing I was going to just speak to, and the member may have a follow-up question, is the member asked about contracts. Well, there was no campaign in which government or Hydro were directing for people to go away as employees and come back as contracts. But contracting within Hydro has been a long-standing feature for some areas of the work, for things like in emergency circumstances, when it comes to responding for fires, if there are rebuilds to be done, where they need to flex workforce because of things like maybe workforce interruptions, as was done this summer through the gas division when one union decided to go on strike. And so in that case, they do have an ability to provide good service and ensure business continuity and safety by bringing on contractors. And I'm sure the member would agree that those are provisions that are prudent and need to be taken to protect ratepayers and to protect safety. So those are some answers I can give at this time, and I invite him to ask other questions as he may have.
The member for St. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do appreciate that information. It is good to hear that diversity metrics are improving. This is good news. We did not hear an answer to the question, though, however, about the total number of hydro employees that were there when the minister's government came into power in 2016. So the question I'm hoping to get clarity on is, what was the total FTE within hydro in 2016 when this government came into power?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and happy to answer the member's question. First of all, I just will refer him to the Manitoba Hydro annual report. And I want to just indicate to him that he can see all operating statistics and financial statistics in the concluding part of that report, including beginning on page 113, exactly the numbers he's looking for by operating year, and it goes back a number of years. So all those numbers in respect of capability, electrical system supply, it talks about FTEs, there's revenues and expenditures, all by year in a nice presentation. So he can find all the FTEs for every year he's looking at. I would want to, for context, indicate to the member that as I indicated to him, even like 2021 workforce at 4,954 in 2022, it was anticipated to be 5,023, and even then anticipated for 2023 at 5,175. Hydro continues to do business. Hydro continues to operate. Hydro continues to hire. And even in this environment, when workforce is challenging to get at, Manitoba has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country, and that has been a source of strength for Manitoba, but certainly it is also increasingly a source of consternation for employers and those who are trying to find workforce. We know that the global pandemic significantly interrupted those normal processes of onboarding new workers. Programs like the Manitoba Provincial Nominee Program were significantly interrupted, but also just the way people moved across the country seeking out new economic advantages for themselves and their families. That was also interrupted. And so we're seeing how that plays out. However, I would want to make a key clarification for the member, and that is that hydro, obviously is a very large utility that operates generating largely hydroelectric. It sends that electricity down transmission lines. It translates that power in places like Dorsey and Riel stations. It then sends that across the manifold of the province, where it translates into power for households, for companies, corporations, industries. It sends that power excess above and beyond what our requirements are domestically to customers outside Manitoba, both in the U.S. and in Canada. And then part of that money, part of that export goes on the spot markets. We're a part of a broad array of electrical, both generators and transmitters. We can both receive inputs and provide distribution to others. I say this in order to distinguish these operations of the corporation from its activities in respect of capital. Every once in a while, and I would welcome the long conversation about the needs for and alternatives to kiosk and Bipole 3. But when hydro builds out a major project like this one, $8.3 billion in respect of kiosk, significantly over budget, budgeted amounts that the former government hid from Manitobans. But when it does so, it must attract and engage additional workforce. And I can indicate to that member that on page 77 of the expert review of Bipole 3 and kiosk, it indicates there, in respect of kiosk for construction, 2,436 project direct jobs. And then other direct jobs, employment stats of 2,175, and even indirect and induced, for a total employment in person years, I should say, not just jobs, but person years, of 8,347. However, I believe at one point in time, kiosk was North America's largest construction project. Many of those jobs, of course, came from outside of our project. Many of those jobs paid income tax in other jurisdictions, was something that the NDP never disclosed to Manitoba. But clearly the member understands that workforce must flex up, and then it must return down on the completion of large capital projects. Corporation makes every effort, of course, in respect of its own employees, to reallocate them, but clearly a project of this size is a composite of both FTEs, own source employees, and contracted employees.
The member for St. James.
I'd like to ask the minister if he could provide a total value of contracted out labor on transmission and generation side of the organization in 2016, and then the total value of contracts issued in the 2021 fiscal year. So the last fiscal year, sorry, 21-22 fiscal year. So again, to repeat, what was the total value of the contracted out labor in 2016-17 fiscal year? And what was the total value of the contracted out labor in the 21-22 fiscal year, specifically for generation and transmission? And I'm not looking for any information related to capital.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome an opportunity to address the member's question. I want to indicate to the member that we've got very significant capability at this table, including Mr. Rob Maurice, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister in Finance, responsible for Crown Corporations in the Secretariat, and Jim Crone and others as Executive Directors in that Secretariat give us good advice. I also have at the table, of course, my Deputy Minister, Richard Crone, and my Treasury Board Secretary, Ann Ilisoy, as well as the Executive Financial Officer for Finance, Mr. Ryan Clausen. So we've got a lot of depth at this table. However, I believe that the member at times is at the wrong table. And we can provide a lot of detail, but we cannot provide the detail he would get from the Hydro Board when the board actually comes to committee on an annual basis. And in that construct, in that capacity, the member would have access to the CEO for Manitoba Hydro. He would have access to the Executive Financial Officer, the Chief Operating Officer, and through them to the array of senior executives and managers who would be able to give the member the level of specificity that he is seeking in respect of a very, very specific request. Members asking for a 5-year parse out of contracted labor, but only on generation transmission and not in respect of capital and a total value. So what I can do is indicate to the member that that's my encouragement to him would be, by all means, to be present at that committee when Hydro presents annually to this legislature in respect of its annual report. Don't miss that meeting. Be sure to ask that question. I can tell you, though, the answer to that question will probably go something like this. Those levels of contracted employees fluctuate over annual operating years. And the reason they would fluctuate is because the question becomes, when does Hydro bring on contract workers? Well, first of all, let's be clear, there is no edict from anyone, no edict from the CEO, no edict from the chair, certainly no edict from this government or this minister that would interfere with Hydro to say somehow that you've got to go out and take away employees who work for Hydro and bring people back as contractors. There is no such initiative. There has been no such directive. We have, of course, through the chair and the board of Hydro, I know that they are always interested in the operations of Hydro to say, what is your workforce? How are you addressing your issues? What are your service standards that you have for these areas? How long does it take you to respond in terms of challenges? But I think a lot of the question about the fluctuations in the number of contracted individuals or groups in a year can also be answered by referring to weather events. Because when Hydro contracts is reflective of environmental conditions. So the member asked about 2016-17. If I remember correct, we had a really big spring storm in 2016-17. I think it was that year. We had some really bad inclement weather. And that would be a case if there had been some lines down. Hydro knows what it has. It knows that workforce that it can flex. It knows what it can produce and generate through overtime. But then beyond that, it may choose to, it might be the executive decision of the company to bring on contract workers. Likewise for fires, I remember one of those years was a very significant summer fire season. And at that time, we had a number of outages. Even right now in Manitoba, we have 2 First Nations communities that are getting by with interventions like diesel generators to allow them to have access to power. They're actively monitoring those situations and providing service. But those things would cause more use of contractors, flexing workforce, using overtime, but then also employing contractors. So I would just want to be sure that they also understand those kind of operational decisions aren't undertaken by the government. They're undertaken by hydro. That level of specificity is best gotten at by going to the hydro committee and asking the question of the CEO and the CFO. The hydro, of course, brings their capital and operating plans to the Treasury Board, have done so for a number of years now. The plan of hydro in respect of operating and capital has never been challenged by Treasury Board. It's been passed as it has been presented. I think it's a rigorous process, far better than in the past.
The member for St. James.
I'm looking forward to that conversation at that committee hearing, and I guess the concern here that the minister doesn't seem to be reflecting on is that his government did in fact require that hydro cut a significant number of jobs. It's well documented. He can reframe it however he'd like, that it's, this is just something that people did on a volunteer basis. I suggested he go back and look at what actually happened in 2016-17 to get a little more familiar with what actually went down in his own department within hydro. We lost hundreds and hundreds of workers as a result of this government requiring that hydro cut down the total number of FTE. The impact of that, if you speak with hydro workers, and again, I encourage the minister to familiarize himself with the file and to go back and maybe connect with people working within the corporation, was significant. That impact, the impact of those cuts resulted in a huge number of people taking on multiple jobs at once. It resulted in unsafe working conditions for a number of workers, especially uniform gas workers. And if you speak with the IBEW membership, what he would learn is that it's essentially resulted in a significant amount of work which was previously done by the corporation being done by contractors. Not as a function of year-to-year fluctuations or fires or storms, but as a direct function of his government's cuts to FTE within hydro. So the question I think that I really would like to get clarity on from the minister is, why does his government believe that contract labor provides better value than Manitoba Hydro workers in doing the work that needs to be done within Manitoba Hydro? Why does his government believe that contracting out with private contractors is better? Why does it provide more value than actually just hiring on Manitoba Hydro workers, hiring those people back that his government let go?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I thank the member for the question. I do want to set the record straight here. The member is making a very blunt foray into trying to elicit some kind of a response that would say that the government prefers private contracts to employees, the Crown Corporation. There's a number of things wrong with the assertion. First of all, the government has no ideological position, as the NDP does, in respect of full-time equivalents versus contract employees. We are proud of our workforce. We're proud of our civil service workforce in Manitoba. As a matter of fact, I think it was just about a week or two ago that we were celebrating excellence in the civil service. There's a number of awards that even at one time I had the pleasure and the honor to give out, where we have an annual awards celebration. And senior leadership can identify people within their organizations who have really excelled and done something that is noteworthy, built new systems, solved problems, collaborated with other groups to get value. These should be things that we all celebrate together. That's done within the civil service. So we celebrate the achievements of our civil service. We're committed to growing a professional and modern civil service. And I invite the member to read more about the plans of our government to facilitate that and to partner with the civil service in how we're doing that. But the other problem with his assertion is it flirts dangerously along the line of somehow saying that the government is directing Hydro in respect of their day-to-day operations, which is completely false. And it harkens back to that expert report on bipolar kiosk, because it's exactly that report that talks about the previous government's interference with Manitoba Hydro. And that is a conversation I would like to have with the member this afternoon. I think he's inviting that conversation directly, and he's actually on sensitive ground, because it was very critical analysis and recommendations that talked about the previous government's interference at Hydro, driving these mega projects for hydro infrastructure, regardless of cost escalation and eroding business case. Erosions in the business case that the government knew about, but did not disclose to Manitobans. So I invite that conversation. However, I think the member may also be asking in respect of last year's decision of one of the unions at Hydro. This was the Uniforce Strike that had taken place last spring. After Hydro actually had successfully negotiated new contracts with AMSI and with QP, but Unifor took a membership vote and they went on strike. What ensued was a natural gas work continuance safe operating procedure. It was developed to provide work instruction to staff assigned as contingency workers in the case of a strike. It outlined service levels and the work that would have to be performed by a contingency workforce. It did not guarantee uninterrupted service, but it sought uninterrupted service wherever it could. It prioritized work based on risk, identified work in high importance, medium importance, low importance. The contingency workforce would be deployed to deal with work of an emergency or safety nature. I would strongly suspect that contingency workforce was made up both of Hydro employees who were redeployed and also flexing to include other workforce like contractors. If the member is suggesting today that Hydro should not have entered into contracts that were designed for safety and business continuance. I read the notes that talked about ensuring safety for Manitobans. When it came to gas division, let him say so in these proceedings that he would put Manitobans knowingly at risk for ideological reasons. We would not do so. However, remember, at the end of the day, governance works this way. The minister has responsibilities, and they are not to directly run Hydro. board, CEO, senior executive management team under the direction of the board of directors. That is who runs hydro. That is who makes day-to-day decisions. That is who operates both in continuous normal circumstances and in emergency circumstances.
The member for St. James.
I'm glad the minister raised the question of who's running hydro, because there's something we touched on last week, but we didn't have a chance to go much further on, and I'm looking forward to discussing that now in relation to his last comments, which is specifically his government's decision to wind down Manitoba Hydro Telecom and to give over our our fiber optic assets over to ExploreNet for what appears to be a song, Mr. Chair. So I'm looking to just maybe have the minister comment initially on why his government chose to wind down Manitoba Hydro Telecom, given the quality of the work that they were doing, and why they chose to hand that fiber over to ExploreNet at no cost.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer the member's question, but just before I segue there, I did want to end my other response, and I regret that my time ran out before I was able to do so. The critic for hydro, the member for St. James, had talked about his concerns of the government, and it really isn't the government, it's hydro, taking on, he said, multiple concurrent projects, which he said created risk, and they should have been staggered. That's interesting to me, because on page 131 of the expert report on Bipole 3 and kiosk, it is exactly this concern by the commissioner that is addressed. The fact that the previous government, and I'm reading from the report here, was managing multiple large projects, and capacity was stretched at Manitoba Hydro. It said, although capacity appeared to have existed for Bipole 3, internal capacity appears to have been lacking with respect to the management of kiosk, particularly in the poor results in 2016, it said. That's the time when we actually inherited that project. The government came into place. This was likely due, it said, to the amount of time that had passed since Hydro's last major generation project. He's referring, of course, to Wasquatum. Hydro did not seem to recognize this lack of internal expertise, or if it did, it failed to address it soon enough through the use of external consultants. And the recommendation that comes from this is to say, the recommendation, surprisingly, is not to say, therefore, fire people and only use external consultants. No. The recommendation does not say that. It says that Manitoba Hydro should use external expertise for high-value future capital projects, and it should plan its capital program where as possible, so that mega projects, multiple mega projects are not constructed simultaneously. Mr. Chair, I find it a point that I should make that the commissioner, the author of the expert review of Bipole 3 and kiosk, is in agreement with the member for St. James today. Both of them caution the former NDP government, who tried to manage too much at one time with an ideological approach of saying we cannot seek expertise. We cannot ask experts. That member last week came very close to taking a run at 3 individuals who acted as the expert advisory group on this kiosk Bipole report. And finally, what stopped his questions is when I started reading their biographies into the record, people who had led Ontario infrastructure for 25 years. People who had done indigenous hydro developments for years and years in North America. And it was at that point that the member, of course, ceased and desisted from his line of questioning. On the subject of Manitoba Hydro Internet, our government was proud to undertake a process that would have seen the dark fiber, as it's referred to in Manitoba, running across this province, plowed in by Manitoba Hydro years ago, essentially utilizing that for the benefit of the hundreds of communities that have substandard levels of internet. This is an issue having to do with equity, equal treatment of communities. It talks about the importance of northern and rural investments, but also it talks about how the connection to high quality fiber optics creates whole other opportunities for these communities. So if the member is suggesting that he doesn't want to see those communities connected, then he should say so today. This initiative was announced by our government in 2020. There was a significant process whereby the government did an RFP. It was a competitive process. There was a proponent. I can assure the member that the work continues to basically use thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable not being used by Manitoba Hydro to extend internet service to underserved rural and northern communities. We're proud of this partnership with ExploreNet. We're proud of the work that is being done.
The member for St. James.
I'd like to ask the minister if he can provide information on the Manitoba Hydro Telecom dividend that Hydro would received annually from Manitoba Hydro Telecom and how that was applied to regulated electricity and gas costs to offset rates.
Order. The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The member is mistaken. The Manitoba Hydro doesn't pay a dividend to the province of Manitoba, and subsidiaries of Hydro don't pay a dividend to Manitoba Hydro. So I'm going to let the member write that down before I continue. So I'll repeat that. Manitoba Hydro doesn't pay a dividend to the province of Manitoba, and subsidiaries of Hydro don't pay a dividend to Hydro. I'm referring to page 114 of the Hydro annual report. The member sees there a statement of revenues breaking down between domestic electric and gas, and there's an extra provincial line as well, and there's other revenues. And so the member knows that those, of course, those amounts are all reported in a consolidated form for the purpose of these financial statistics. It's a good presentation. It goes back a number of fiscal years, and it's within those parameters that any income, were there to be any from subsidiary areas of Hydro, would be reported. The member knows the timeline on which these decisions were made. Essentially in 2019, Crown Services at the time and Central Services proceeded to issue an RFQ, a request for qualifications. There were proponents who answered that those bids were adjudicated. And then the RFP was actually issued in 2020 in summer. And the announcement was made of the top ranking proponent. Contracts were signed, and the work continues to connect these northern and rural communities to high-speed internet. I would want the member to understand, of course, that this was not somehow utilizing component pieces of Hydro's high-speed internet that they were currently using. Rather, Hydro had connectivity adequately and sufficiently for the future in respect of its assets to connect it, to meet its obligations, to provide high-speed service. And this was in respect of hosting and utilization of the additional strands of fiber optic thread for the purpose of signing additional customers. The original press release states that the objective is to connect more than 125,000 unserved or underserved Manitobans to reliable high-speed internet services. It indicates who the proponent is, ExploreNet Communications. It talks about the fact that even 30 First Nations and 270 rural and northern communities will be connected. And then it includes as well 350 communities with cell phone access. And it's a partnership, a collaboration, where Hydro has the fiber, the government undertakes to grant the contract, a third party comes in and bids and takes up that responsibility, and the recipients, the beneficiaries, are Manitobans who get service that they didn't otherwise have, far faster than that would otherwise have been the case. I would want to be clear, the member asked a question about why do it at all. We have always had the concern for Hydro to concentrate on its core mandate. Hydro has nothing in its act to say that it should be out there in the retail space, connecting individuals to high-speed internet and doing that work. It's completely outside of Manitoba's core mandate to provide affordable power to Manitoba households, commercial entities, business entities, industrial users, and to export for profit for the benefit of ratepayers that which it does not use itself in terms of surplus energy. So there is nothing outside of that context where Hydro should focus on its core mandate, and services, these high-speed services, can then be offered to Manitobans on existing infrastructure where Hydro can simply basically devolve the opportunity in respect of fiber to a different actor. The government is proud to be able to be continuing to provide high-speed internet to Manitobans who would otherwise not have this service.
The member for St. James.
I appreciate that 15 minutes after the minister stated that his government doesn't interfere in the decision-making at Hydro, that he just confirmed that his government has interfered in the decision-making of Hydro and is in fact directing them to wind down Manitoba Hydro Telecom. So I appreciate that clarification. He didn't answer the question, however. So I'll say it differently. I think he knows what I was asking. I called it a dividend. I'll restate the question and hopefully a little more clearly here. I'm looking to understand the total amount of revenue for Manitoba Hydro that was created by Manitoba Hydro Telecom and how that was applied to regulated electricity and gas rates in Manitoba.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Well, once again, I would welcome a conversation on governance where the previous government interfered directly in the operations of Hydro, chronicled completely and at length in the expert report on kiosk and BIPOL. And the cost of that interference was billions of dollars of cost overruns. That commissioner for that report made clear that the government, NDP government, hid the escalating costs of the projects from Manitobans, that they circumvented the processes that were designed to test the projects for value. The needs for and alternatives to process was never even applied to billions of dollars of assets. And then when the government knew the true escalating costs, they underreported those amounts to Manitoba. No wonder he called for a calibration and a renewed understanding of what everyone's role is, what the CEO of Hydro's role is, what the minister responsible for Hydro, what their role is, what the board chair's role is, and what cabinet's role is, the executive council. And so when the member makes the claim that somehow because the government of Manitoba has an interest in using dark fiber not utilized by Hydro to connect communities all across Manitoba's north and rural communities, that is tantamount to interference in Hydro, he's completely false. Completely off the mark. I want to read for the member from the annual report of Hydro what Hydro actually does. Manitoba Hydro is a provincial crown corporation. I'm on page 14. And one of the largest integrated electricity and natural gas distribution utilities in Canada. We are a leader in providing renewable hydroelectricity and clean burning natural gas, energy for life, that powers our province and supports our economic growth. We are a forward-looking utility that keeps the best interests of our customers at the forefront, functioning both as a responsive, reliable supplier of electricity and natural gas, and as a trusted energy advisor for our customers as the energy landscape continues to change. We also trade electricity with 4 wholesale markets in the Midwest United States and Canada. I noticed that nowhere in the corporate profile does it indicate that the core mission and mandate of Manitoba Hydro is to use dark fiber and get into the internet business by competing directly with companies like, I don't know, Rogers and Bell MTS and ExploreNet and Valley Fiber and who knows who else in this province is all providing internet. It doesn't say that anywhere, because that is not the core mission and mandate of Hydro. The decision to undertake to simply light up that unused fiber is a smart one. And it's one that Manitobans say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. There's underserved communities. The fiber optic lines run right past these communities, did when the NDP were in power, but they did nothing about it. And so the enterprise in principle is one that will see benefit to thousands of Manitobans, and it's why we undertook to go in that direction. I want to indicate to the member that the total consolidated revenue reportable to Hydro in the year that finished 2021 was $6 million. That's in total. And I would like to read into the record an indication of what those subsidiaries at Hydro are. You just had it in front of you, the subsidiaries of Hydro. Sorry, we're managing multiple documents in front of us. So I just wanted to indicate the consolidated financial statements include the accounts of Manitoba Hydro, as well as the wholly owned subsidiaries, including Central Gas Manitoba Inc., Manel Pipelines Limited, Manitoba Hydro International Limited, Manitoba Hydro Utility Services Limited, Tashmont LP Holdings Limited, and 66900271 Manitoba. And I believe that is the list of consolidated subsidiaries.
The member for St. James.
Sadly, I still did not receive a response specifically about Manitoba Hydro Yeah, that was a consolidated summary of revenues, at least unless I misheard. We were asking specifically for the amount of revenue that Manitoba Hydro Telecom generated for Hydro on a yearly basis and how that impacted electricity and gas rates. I can completely understand why the minister is avoiding wanting to talk about that more specifically, because it would highlight the fact that the decision that this government has made to shut down Manitoba Hydro Telecom is going to increase the cost of hydro for all Manitobans. I do want to ask the minister a question about the value of contracts that Manitoba Hydro Telecom had in place with Manitoba-based internet service provider companies. There are, I think, somewhere in the range of 50 internet service provider small businesses in Manitoba that for a long time partnered with Manitoba Hydro Telecom to expand access to broadband for people, especially in our rural and northern communities. They were doing a phenomenal job until this government decided to come in and to hand over that dark fiber and the infrastructure. We're not just talking about unused fiber, we're also talking about towers and other infrastructure that the minister has failed to identify in his summary of what's being handed over to ExploreNet. And so my question for the minister is the value of those contracts that were in place between Manitoba Hydro Telecom and those ISPs. What was the value of those contracts? What was the total value of those contracts before Manitoba Hydro Telecom was shut down? And I would also ask if the minister can provide some clarity. We know, of course, that an RFP did go forward. ExploreNet was the winner of that RFP. The contracts that were in place between ISPs and Manitoba Hydro Telecom would have also been sold off to ExploreNet as part of that deal. We'd like some clarity on the total value of that sale to ExploreNet for what was the value of those contracts in that sale. And that would have been a separate and different aspect of the sale, not the access to the fiber, but the value of the contracts themselves that were sold to ExploreNet as part of the deal.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things in answer to the members' questions. First of all, I had indicated before, he might be at the wrong table and that there's some degree of specificity he's seeking. I said earlier that he would be advised to go to the Hydro Committee when they're before the legislature and ask those questions directly to the CEO and the CFO. And I would say the same recommendation of mine would apply to him when it comes to the breakdown. So I read at least, I think, 6 subsidiaries of Hydro into the record, and I indicated their revenues last year. Total net revenues at $6 million. I can say to him that in respect of this year, it was $9 million. That's for all the subsidiaries. So when you consider that the revenue at Hydro was declared at $3.04 billion, and the net revenues of 6 subsidiaries were $9 million. I mean, you're talking about a very, very small percentage of revenue, but that's from all the subsidiaries. So it is possible that the revenues that are ratioed in terms of Hydro's total revenues to this one subsidiary may be less than 1%, could be half a percentage point. The member was trying to say, what impact would this have had on rate determinations? The answer would be nil, because it would never reach the test of materiality when it comes to determinations of rates. However, on the other question, I had said earlier that the member may be sitting at the wrong table, and now I even have actually more information that could be the case. Because what that press release does make clear that I referred to earlier in the afternoon, the one where in 2021, when the government announced the award of this tender to ExploreNet Communications, is that it was actually a procurement exercise, and that this initiative has been handled by the department which is entitled Labor, Consumer Protection, and Government Services. So when it comes to specific details about the state of the contract, of course, the first thing I would say to the member is some of that will not be disclosable, simply because that member knows that there will be contracts signed and there will be non-disclosure conditions within those contracts, and those are due to competitiveness, and that no company can have the exact details of their bid revealed to the company, or it may compromise the contract itself. It could significantly contract. I've learned more and more in my time about procurement law. I am no expert, but having been the chair of the Treasury Board and been the Minister of Finance before this return to my role, certainly I've come to understand more about the conditions and the environment in which that solicitation for work must occur. What are the rules that guide those interactions? What can you disclose to competitors? What can you not disclose to competitors? What are the timelines you must respect? And what are the intervals within those things? How much time is adequate time to allow for a solicitation of bids? And so it's a complex area, and that is why we have a department with that expertise. So when it comes to these particular questions about, the assignment of customers, or what assets were included, answer being none. Of course, Hydro continues to own its assets. There's no devolution of assets of Hydro. But those questions are better asked of the Department of Labor, Consumer Protection, and Government Services. But there's good news, because we are in that part of our legislative year whereby 3 sections of the Committee of Supply sit concurrently. So we're not counting down 1 hour at a time of the 100 hours that are set aside for the consideration of departmental estimates, but 3. And I understand that just this afternoon, probably in Committee Room 255, it may be the chamber, but both are a short walk, that the Department of Labor, Consumer Protection, and Government Services is sitting this afternoon. The Deputy Minister responsible for procurement, the Minister responsible for procurement, and these questions could be easily asked of that table. If he would want to, he could send one of his colleagues out, write those questions on a page, and see if they would like to use their time to ask those questions of the Minister who holds the contracts and undertook to structure these arrangements.
The member for St. James?
Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up. I have a copy of an email here from the Deputy Minister for Crown Services, which was sent to the CEO of Hydro in January 21st, 2021. And the email, there's a section from it I'll read. ExploreNet has proposed an additional $50 million for Manitoba Hydro Telecom's book of business, but this is separate and apart from the fiber assets and are on top of the fiber asset access. We actually see this as a bonus, as the book of business was going to whoever won the zones anyways in exchange for the fiber and cellular investments. So I'd like to again ask the minister if he can comment on the fact that his government is encouraging the private sale, the privatization of what here is estimated as about $50 million worth of contracts. Can he provide comment on what I just read?
I would ask the member for St. James. In your last remarks, you were reading, just asking if you were reading from a private correspondence, and if so, you have to table that. The member for St. James?
I'm happy to copy a table of the email.
Okay, thank you. The Honourable Minister of Finance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My advice to the member is going to be similar to the advice I provided him just earlier, but I would make a couple of clarifications. Of course, we've clearly said this afternoon, and clarified the record that government, I've read into the record the core mission and mandate of Manitoba Hydro from its annual report. Clearly, this is outside any connection of fiber optics in terms of dark fiber, unutilized fiber within that fiber trunk. I believe that's the term that they use, that fiber trunk line. That's clearly outside of the mandate of Hydro, the core mandate of Hydro. So the decision for government to undertake to facilitate an RFP, a request for proposals, first a request for qualifications, then a request for proposals, is completely above board. It's legitimate. It's actually preferable, because Manitoba Hydro faces challenges of its own. And I would love to talk about the challenges of Manitoba Hydro in respect of variance on revenue forecasting, the ongoing threat of weather conditions that has a plus minus $200 million, $300 million variation in how it performs in a year. We've seen the evidence of that in the last couple of fiscal years. Hydro has challenges in respect of inflation and holding a lot of debt that has tripled under the previous government. And of course, that debt has to be serviced. Debt comes with a debt service cost. Debt service cost goes up as interest rates rise, as they have with the Bank of Canada seeking and then acting to raise the rates for lending 5 times since January. Hydro has other challenges in respect of the renegotiation of American contracts, the state of its good state of repair of assets, challenges in respect of transitioning to the future and being able to pivot to seize the opportunity of green energy, and other challenges as well. But clearly, Hydro should be focused on addressing those challenges. That is where the senior management team is focused. That's where the board of directors is focused. So it's appropriate and it's preferable that this work be undertaken not within hydro. It reminds me of when I was elected to the legislature in 2011. I know the member for Portage la Prairie was as well at the same time. I can neither reflect on his presence or absence in these committee proceedings. But at the time, I remember that shortly thereafter, it might have been 2014, and the minister responsible for, let me get this right, infrastructure? The minister responsible for the Crown Corporation, it might have been Liquor and Lotteries, brought a bill that sought to do infrastructure, to pave roads within a Crown Corporation's budget. We were bewildered by the bill. It sought an allocation from the Crown Corporation to go directly to paving. Oh, I know what it was. It was MPI, because they said, well, there's probably a benefit to MPI paving potholes because that way the claims wouldn't be so big. And it was clear interference in the internal workings of the Crown Corporation, interference by the previous NDP government, going right around their board of directors, going right around their CEO, interfering in the core mandate of MPI, saying you're now going to pave potholes. And of course, the bill never really saw the light of day. I think it got first reading. There was an incredibly poor reception to the bill. And the minister finally backed off and said it's probably not appropriate for the NDP to be paving potholes out of the MPI budget. And I'd love to hear the members' comments on that in the past. So talk about interference of a Crown Corporation. However, I would say again to the member, part of what he's asking simply cannot be disclosed because of contract law and ongoing negotiations. But the majority of the questions that he is asking that are appropriate should be directed to the minister responsible for labor, consumer protection, and government services, which is currently sitting in the Committee of Supply, probably about 80 meters from this committee table, right in the Manitoba legislature. Those proceedings are happening concurrent with these proceedings, and I would encourage him, in respect of the contract itself, to pose those questions to that minister, who's deputy minister responsible for procurement, who helped to oversee and to develop this contract, is sitting and answering questions at this very time.
Member for St. James.
Just want to again reiterate, put on the record here that we've got email from government clarifying that, in fact, this government is selling off $50 million, approximately $50 million worth of contracts that were held between Manitoba Hydro Telecom and private businesses, and are handing over those profitable contracts to a private business. In this case, a internationally owned, hedge fund owned infrastructure company in the name of ExploreNet. The minister has repeatedly talked about how Manitoba Hydro Telecom's work was not within Hydro's core mandate. I would remind the minister that Manitoba Hydro Telecom has been doing this work for many years underneath Manitoba Hydro, has been doing that very successfully. There's a team of individuals that have been working at Manitoba Hydro Telecom that have been doing spectacular work for many, many years, partnering with small businesses in Manitoba, expanding access to broadband across this province, and have been doing a really great job of that. And what happened was, when his government decided to wind them down, they've essentially created a multi-pronged disaster. And I'm happy to just sort of spell out for the minister some of the ways that his government's decision has impacted Manitobans here. First, their government's decision to hand over the fiber to ExploreNet has resulted in a near freezing up of broadband expansion in significant portions of the province. The reason for that is because when they issued the RFP, Manitoba Hydro Telecom's work with ISPs was frozen for approximately a year. And once ExploreNet was awarded the contract, they continue to be frozen and are continuing to delay working with ISPs. So we're now about a year and a couple months into work being frozen in a huge portion of the province. And now we're staring down the barrel of potentially another year of customers across rural and northern regions of Manitoba waiting to get access to broadband because of this government's decision at a time when broadband has never been more important, Mr. Chair. Second big impact I want to clarify and just help the minister understand, because it doesn't seem he's had enough conversations with folks in this sector, is that the ISP businesses that worked with Manitoba Hydro Telecom, there's approximately 40 of them that are being hugely negatively impacted. And I encourage him to go back and read a recent Martin Cash article where he interviews a number of people from those businesses. He doesn't have to take my word for it. He can go back and listen to those small businesses and learn about the impacts of his government's decision on their business. And many of those businesses are being threatened. Those are good businesses. Those are good Manitoban jobs. And they're being wiped out because of his government's decision making. And the last piece that is really concerning is, again, the impact on hydro rates that this decision will make by giving away profitable contracts to ExploreNet. So I understand he doesn't want to clarify, and he wants me to go speak to someone in a different room, even though he is the minister responsible for hydro and should be very aware of what's happening under Manitoba Hydro, but I will not press the question of those contracts any further. I would like just to ask him generally, though, why does he believe that Manitoba Hydro Telecom and the employees there were not doing a good job of expanding broadband in Manitoba? Why does he believe that an internationally owned hedge fund owned company like ExploreNet would do a better job of expanding access to broadband when Manitoba Hydro Telecom has been doing this work for years and sending profits to Manitoba Hydro ratepayers?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was referring earlier to the time in which Manitoba Hydro will be back in front of the standing committee in the legislature. But I'm actually, I have in front of me right now the standing committee notes from the previous appearance of Manitoba Hydro CEO Jay Graywall and along with her senior officials. That meeting took place at January 14th, 2022. And I'm going to quote from the CEO. Was a cost, I'm just gonna make sure I'm in the right place. Yeah. Was a cost analysis done prior to the RFQ and RFP? We're speaking about this initiative to light the dark fiber for the purpose of connecting 125,000 Manitoba households who were underserved or unserved by high-speed internet. Was the cost analysis done prior to the RFQ and RFP that was put out, as recently announced, about the difference in keeping it in-house or outsourcing the delivery of broadband? So the member should get ready, because here's the direct answer to his question. Should we do it in-house or should we outsource the delivery of the broadband? This is not the minister speaking now. This is the CEO for Manitoba Hydro. And here's the answer. This announcement will see improved broadband service and connectivity offered to many northern, rural, and Indigenous communities in Manitoba. ... Very positive news, exclamation mark. We also performed, as part of our review of the entire Manitoba Hydro business, a review of Manitoba Hydro International, of which MHT is a part. Our analysis showed that the course of action we took to return our focus to our core business of energy provision was in the best interests of our customers and all Manitobans, end quote. The CEO of Hydro is on the record as saying, number one, they did a review of MHI, Manitoba Hydro International. Number two, that Manitoba Hydro Telecom is a part of MHI. And the results of that analysis and investigation, underled by the board of directors, was a report that indicated that it would be best to actually do this work by outsourcing the delivery of broadband rather than keeping it in-house. I secondly want to refer the member to the directive to Hydro from the government of Manitoba, issued in the summer, I believe, of 2021. I can check whether it was exactly the summer. It was November of 2021. And I'm reading there, the directive provides instruction to Manitoba Hydro to make available surplus capacity of its owned fiber optic cable network. So the first deal is surplus capacity, and certain other assets in Manitoba to ExploreNet Communications, who won the contract, at no incremental cost or impact to Manitoba Hydro ratepayers or existing Manitoba Hydro broadband customers. At no incremental cost or impact. There is no negative impact on the ratepayer. Hydro is kept whole in this regard. The third question he asks about, did I think that they were doing a bad job, is a highly ideological question, very leading, designed to elicit some kind of a statement that would say we think that, Hydro is bad, but the private sector is good, and that's nonsense. The fact of the matter is that that member knows that under his government, the debt of Hydro was tripled within the last 7 years. That debt now stands at $24 billion. This is a major build-out of capital to energize high-speed internet for 125,000 households. Hydro does not have the access to markets. It doesn't have the capital capability. Why? Because of bipole and kiosk being billions of dollars overspent. So I thank that member for making our point that capital sunk costs cannot be revisited, that those opportunities have passed, and now it's appropriate to defer that investment and that cost and that risk and that capital generated in private markets to a group who has that expertise to go get that job done, which is outside of the core mandate of hydro.
The member for St. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask the minister if he can confirm whether or not he signed off on the $50 million, on the sale of the $50 million book of business from Manitoba Hydro Telecom. Was there, at any point, was he as minister required to sign off in support of, first of all, that valuation, that $50 million valuation? And secondly, did he sign off on that valuation and give Hydro the go-ahead to sell off those contracts privately?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I know that my special assistant, Mr. Connor Very, is carefully monitoring the time that is available to us, but I'm sure he's about to advise me that we only have 13 minutes remaining in these afternoon proceedings, and so I have only 13 minutes to offer that member to extricate himself from this committee hearing, give the helm to one of his colleagues at the table, or grant time to the Liberal Party, and go see the minister responsible for this contract, the minister responsible for labor, consumer protection, and government services, who holds the contract with Xplornet, who developed the process that led to the RFQ and the RFP, and the granting of that contract, and the public disclosure of that contract. The member should avail himself of the opportunity to go see the experts on this subject. That's exactly where he can seek those answers. Short answer to the member's question, though, is no.
The member for St. James.
Okay. At any time, did members of the Department of Crown Services propose a price for Xplornet to be able to access the fiber? And so I'm talking about specifically the infrastructure. Contracts are put aside now. Was the department involved in any way in proposing a price for which Xplornet would be required to pay in order to access the fiber assets?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I know that we probably only have 9 minutes remaining in these proceedings, and so I do want to encourage the member, like there is a department that holds the contract and holds the pen on this, and that government department is the longest name in all of government departments. I think it's even longer than community wellness and mental health and community wellness, although that's a long title too. But the minister responsible for Labor, Consumer Protection, and Government Services is in the Committee of Supply this very afternoon, probably in Committee Room 254. I think we're in 255 here. Yep. And so he's best able, with his deputy minister, to answer questions specific to the contract. However, I just would want to make clear again for these proceedings a couple of key points for the member so he can understand what this is and what this isn't. Internet fiber optics are not a core piece of Manitoba Hydro's mandate. I read that mandate into the record this afternoon. Electric generation, electric transmission, service of customers, sale of additional surplus power, low rates, green energy. That's the story of Hydro. The member says, well, why don't you just let Hydro do this work? Easy, NDP. The NDP burned through billions and billions of dollars of cost overruns, which they deliberately hid from Manitobans. But that money, when expended, is spent. It can't be unspent. Those assets are fixed. Those costs are incurred. Those debt schedules take place. Those amortization schedules, as prescribed by public sector accounting standards, are in place. Debts have to be repaid. And so this becomes an opportunity of cost avoidance for the government of Manitoba, who is able to then contract with a third party that says, we will take on the risk. We have this expertise. This is our business area of expertise. We will cobble capital together. We will come up with a plan. We will get workforce. We will handle logistics, and we will work in conjunction with Hydro to be able to do the build out. What does that investment look like by ExploreNet? I believe it was publicly announced as a $500 million investment to connect 125,000 communities in Manitoba, in the north and in rural communities. Now, one thing's for certain, this member wouldn't have done it. The member for St. James, he's made it clear on the record. He wouldn't have done it. He is so bound by his ideological blinders that he would say it is better for Manitoba communities to not be connected. He also said earlier, why would Manitoba Hydro Telecom not do it themselves? I heard no plan in the last 15 years from Manitoba Hydro Telecom to take the bull by the horns, to light dark fiber in this kind of way, and to invest $500 million. I don't think they could have gotten that past the board of directors, because the board of Hydro would have asked one question. Well, what's your core mandate? Is this your core mandate? And so, I know that Manitoba Hydro Telecom was doing something, and now that something has become very, very much more significant. So a few fundamental points. Hydro owns and maintains telecommunications facilities throughout the province. And for the purpose of allowing it to monitor and maintain and operate its bulk electric systems, generating and transmitting and distributing energy. We issued a directive to Hydro to say, there's unutilized fiber, we should use it, but a third party can do that better. Hydro maintains ownership of its fiber optic network. It's not privatization of Hydro. It's another step in the journey of focusing on the core business of Hydro. And that was something that the CEO for Hydro said at the committee in January of 2022. The province has lifted the stop sell, and Manitoba Hydro is in communication with customers. We're in discussions with MHT about improved network services. ExploreNet is required to build a new infrastructure, connect the customers. It'll take some years, and that contract is still underway. And costs associated with integrating future expansion of services will be borne by ExploreNet. And I repeat, there is no increased cost or negative impacts to Hydro or Hydro customers caused by the change.
The member for St. James.
Chair, not surprised to hear the minister make a solid argument in favor of privatization there. I'm not sure why he's thinking that he should stop with hydro. Why not go elsewhere? I mean, we know that his government is doing that. They're offloading risk and allowing private interests to bring their capital to bear in healthcare and other areas of government. So again, not a surprise to hear him make an argument in favor of that. I would like to ask the minister, one thing that we understand that ExploreNet was going to be required to provide as part of the arrangement was expansions not only in broadband service, but also in cellular service. I'd like to ask the minister about whether or not ExploreNet is still expected to make expansions and access to cellular service as part of the work that they're doing. And I would also like to draw to the attention of the minister that ExploreNet's cellular division was sold off a year and a half ago. So hoping for some clarity as to whether or not we are still expecting them to expand access to cellular service as part of the deal.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Knowing the time is short this afternoon, I'll delve straight into an answer and indicate to the member that specific questions pertaining to the contract in respect of both fiber optics and the cellular component should be posed to the minister responsible for labor, consumer protection, and government services. However, to his question from the previous exchange and volley about why couldn't Manitoba Hydro just do it, I remind the member that the annual carrying costs of debt for Manitoba Hydro are reported in these financial reports at $1.1 billion. That amount of carrying cost is multiples of what it was just a short 10 years ago. Manitoba Hydro does not have the capacity to do what he's asking them to do simply because they're constrained by debt. A debt which Manitoba Hydro, its board and its CEO are working to be able to stabilize. Bill 36 does the same, but I know we are not supposed to refer to that bill in these proceedings, so I will keep my reference to that bill very, very short. However, it is no small thing to think about the impact of the completion of Kiosk Generating Station of Bipole 3 transmission line and the $3.7 billion of cost overruns. I would welcome an opportunity in these proceedings to talk to that member about the cost per kilowatt hour when it comes to these assets. It would be really good for him to understand in these current environment, in this current financial environment, what you get for your dollar per kilowatt hour for a new build. And it is really shocking to know the amount of debt that comes online. And of course, that debt means it's a challenge for Hydro to keep those rates low. We all know that the former NDP government threatened those low rates at Hydro.
Order. The hour being 5 p.m. Committee rise.